Hello, class. Today we're going to be tackling chapter number 3, which is adapting to others. So, if you look at the front of the PowerPoint, I have a picture of Barack Obama, his wife, and his 2 children. I'm not sure how many of you followed the 2012 presidential election, but for those of you who did, it probably took some of you by surprise. In 2012, we witnessed an embattled president win his second term in a sluggish and lackluster economic recovery. If you watched the news, you saw both Republicans and Democrats come up with various strategies and theories on how Obama won. Nevertheless, both political parties underscored Obama's demographic advantages. Voters' analysis of 2012 showed Obama had captured 55% of women, 93% of African Americans, 71% of Hispanics, and 73% of Asians. Although Mitt Romney won 59% of the white vote to Obama's 39%, it still, at the end of the day, it still wasn't enough to overcome his losses among women and ethnic minority groups. Now, I want you to pause for a second and take a moment to reflect on this, because this is pretty important. Had this been 20 or 30 years ago, and a presidential candidate only won 39% of the white vote, for those of you old enough to kind of realize that type of world, the outcome of the election would have been totally different. The 2012 election provides evidence that the majority culture in the U.S. is rapidly moving to a multicultural and multi-ethnic society. So therefore, learning to understand each other, learning to understand other cultures, and how to communicate effectively is very important as you move forward in this multicultural society. So that's what we're really going to focus in Chapter 3. And we're going to cover a lot of different themes on culture, and also barriers to understanding each other, and see what we can do to better interact with each other and communicate and relate to one another. All right, let's move on. It's culture. Well, culture is a learned set of shared interpretations about beliefs, values, norms, social practices of a group of people. Now, I'll position this to you just like I position it to my in-person classes. Is culture and race the same thing? No, not necessarily. Just because you have a racial group of people doesn't mean that a person can't belong to a different culture. If they share the same beliefs and values and social practices of a group of people, and they're accepted within that group of people, they can actually be considered a part of that culture, even if their race doesn't match the culture of that people that they belong to. So culture and race are not necessarily the same thing, and I think that's important to note, to point out. Co-cultures are cultures within inside of a culture. So you might have Western cowboys, for example. Is that a co-culture? Sure. Is it a culture within the United States culture, the culture of the U.S.? Absolutely. So co-cultures are cultures that are subcultures or exist as a subset of a larger culture. This goes without saying, interaction with people of other cultures is inevitable, and intercultural communication is absolutely necessary in today's society. Think about where you work, where you play, maybe even where you worship. Learning how to communicate with people across cultural lines is going to be significant to having a successful life here in America, which is a very multicultural type of country. So in interacting with people from different cultures, different communities, different backgrounds, there are oftentimes barriers to understanding other people. So let's look at some of the barriers that are caused to understanding people from different cultures, backgrounds, and ethnic backgrounds. So ethnocentrism is one of them, and that's the belief that your culture is superior and therefore is the only culture that matters. You'll hear this said a lot. You'll have people sit there and say, doggone it, this is America, and in America we speak American. All right, what are some problems with that? Number one, American's not even a language. Number two, if they're referring to English, I'll pose the question to you, does the United States of America have a national language? The answer is no. Okay? And a lot of times when you're looking at ethnocentrism, that is a stimulant. I mean, we talked about stimuli, right, in the last chapter. And when you're so focused on one stimuli that you can't see the other things that are going on. Ethnocentrism, focusing on your own culture, your own cultural group, is a form of stimuli. And what happens is when you are guilty of ethnocentrism, a lot of times you can't perceive what other cultures are going on around you, what their needs are, what their challenges are, and it's hard to relate to those other cultures. So if I can encourage you guys to do one thing, is to take your eyes beyond your culture and look at other cultures and try to broaden your perspectives to what their needs are, what their concerns are, and what's going on in their communities. Stereotypes, generalizations that oversimplify the group's characteristics. So we stereotype a lot. And I explained this to my in-person classes that a lot of times we demonize stereotyping and we demonize prejudices. And although they're not good, I think one important thing that we need to do is to, number one, admit that we do them. We're all guilty of it. It doesn't matter if you're black or white or Hispanic or Asian. I think we're all at some point guilty of stereotyping a group of people at some point or another. I'll provide you an example. A couple years ago, I was at a sports bar with some friends and we were singing karaoke. During the time we were having drinks, we were having a good time. Then a group of African American women walked in and sat down at another table. Similar to our table, they were ordering drinks and having food. And after a few minutes of hanging out, one of the ladies from that group got up and went to the front to put in to sing a song for karaoke. I was looking at her, and she was a larger African American lady. And I remember sitting there seeing her put in to sing a song, and I got excited. I was thrilled. Why was I thrilled? I was thrilled that she was going to sing the roof off. I was looking around like, oh my gosh, these people don't even know. This large African American woman is going to blow the roof down with her powerhouse, soulful voice. Sure enough, her turn came. She got up there and grabbed the microphone. The music started. It was a slow R&B song, and I was just chomping at the bits to listen to her voice. I was trying to figure out before she sang how I was going to compliment her voice and try to tell her how wonderful she was. And then she sang. It was the worst song, the worst voice I've ever heard in my life. She couldn't hit a note if she paid for it. That's how horrible her voice sounded. And I couldn't believe that I was sitting there in disbelief that she could sing like that. Sing so terribly. And in that moment, I was confronted with my own stereotypes and my own stereotype and race-based stereotype. Now, how did I get to the stereotype? Well, obviously, she's an African American woman. But looking at that, I was imagining, because of Aretha Franklin, Chaka Khan, Gladys Knight, Patti LaBelle, the one girl who sang really good before she lost all the weight. Well, she sings good now. What is her name? Jennifer Hudson. You have all these women who are African American. They're large, medium to large, and they have these great voices. And I thought, oh my gosh, because I see these other women and they fit this category, then she's going to fit in the same category. And that wasn't the case. She couldn't sing at all. And, you know, as an African American male myself, I was confronted with my own ethnic stereotypes. And I say that to say this: we all do it. And what I want to encourage you guys to do is get to the place where you don't deny the fact that you stereotype other people, but you acknowledge them, and then you can confront them. If you don't ever acknowledge the fact that we have stereotypes, that we have implicit racial biases, it's really hard to combat them. So that's what I have to say about that. So let's move forward. Prejudice is either positive or negative attributes based on little or no direct experiences with the person or group. So to say something like, most Asians are good at math, that's a prejudice. It's positive, but nevertheless it is a prejudice. Colorblindness, treating people as equal regardless of their race, culture, and ethnic background. This term is not found in your textbook, So it's going to be really important that you take notes or highlight it on the PowerPoint that's provided for chapters 1 through 3, because you might see this on an exam. So treating people as equal regardless of their race, culture, and ethnic background. What are some problems that can arise from colorblindness? That's become a hot word in our society. Oh, I'm colorblind. I don't see race. I don't see color. I treat everybody as equal. Well, let me provide you an example of how this can be problematic. Let's say I had a room full of 10 different plants. Each plant is different. But what I do and how I treat those plants is I say to myself, I'm going to treat each plant, even though they're different plants, I'm going to treat all plants equally. I'm going to give them the same exposure to sunlight, and I'm going to give them the same ration of water. 2 weeks within doing that, I realized that 5 of the 10 plants are dying. And in doing that, what's the problem that I'm having? Well, obviously, if you think about it, the fact that I have 10 different plants, but I'm treating them all the same, is probably the issue at heart. Since every plant is different, I actually need to treat each plant differently. And just because you're treating things equally doesn't mean that you're treating them equitably. To treat things equitably means to give that specific plant what it needs to thrive. And what one plant needs to thrive is different than what the other plant might need to thrive. And so a lot of times in colorblindness, we do the same thing with people. We sit there and say, hey, I don't see race, I don't see color, I don't see disability, I don't see anything like that. I just treat everybody the same. But in doing that, it's problematic. Because although you might be treating people equally, you may fail to treat them equitably and treat people the way they need to be treated. And also ignoring the fact that there are embedded injustices that might cause them not to be treated equal. And to be colorblind is to turn a blind eye to those type of things. So this chapter, in this module, you're actually going to have a video in your discussion posts. You're going to watch a video called White Like Me. It's an hour long, but I'd encourage you to watch the whole thing, because if you don't, you're going to have trouble answering all the questions. So please prepare this week for watching the video in its entirety and answering the questions. But it's really going to hit this point home, and I can't explain it any better than the video does. So you really want to watch that video, but I'm just touching on it a little bit during our time together here in the PowerPoint. So discrimination, this is really important. You're going to see this on the test. Discrimination relates to how we act out prejudices. So just because you're prejudiced doesn't necessarily, a person might be prejudiced, doesn't necessarily mean that they're acting in a discriminatory fashion. People might have prejudiced attitudes, but discriminating is actually acting out the prejudice attitude. It's not renting a house to an African American family because you're scared of, or you have prejudices about them. It's not hiring a certain group of people because you have prejudices about them. It's when you actually act out prejudice. So make sure you understand the difference between prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is an attitude. Discrimination is when you take the prejudice attitude and you apply it to actions. I hope that's clear enough, but it's important that you know the difference between the two. Racism is the assumption inherent characteristics make a race of people inferior or superior. Metacommunication. I didn't mention this earlier, but I'm going to mention this now. Metacommunication is communication about communication. The reason why I brought this concept up is because it's really important to know that you can actually set the standard of your communication. I give an example earlier in my in-person classes saying that, hey, whenever there's conflict or there's something going wrong, there's a breakdown of communication or things are tense, you can really use metacommunication to lighten the load or to make things smoother in tense situations. And here's what I mean by that. Let's say you're in a situation where you're having an argument or disagreement with somebody and starting to get heated, and the person is yelling at you or insulting you or raising their voice. If you're like me and a person does that, your inclination is to raise your voice too. If they insult you, you naturally want to insult them back. But metacommunication, if you use it properly, you can diffuse a lot of that. And here's what I mean by that. Metacommunication is communication about communication, meaning you have the right to communicate the standards of the interaction. So if you use metacommunication properly, let's say somebody's yelling at you and they're insulting you. Here's how you can use metacommunication. You can communicate about communication. You can say, hey, listen, I understand your concern and I want to have this conversation with you, but I'm not going to tolerate yelling at me. So you can't yell. You have to lower your voice, and we're not going to insult each other. That's an example of metacommunication. What happened? You communicated the standard in which you're willing to communicate. I hope that makes sense. Now, why is it here in Barriers of Understanding Other Cultures? The reason why I have it here is because we just talked about prejudice, we just talked about discrimination, and we also talked about racism. Metacommunication is not just useful as far as addressing conflict, but it's also useful in creating a positive, affirmative communication climate. Meaning, if somebody is around you telling, let's say, racial slurs or homophobic jokes or something like that, you can meta-communicate that. You can sit there and say, hey, listen, when you're around me, those jokes are very insensitive. Those jokes are very homophobic, and I find them offensive, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't say those types of things. And what it does is it turns you just from a bystander into actually an agent, a person acting instrumental to change society. So you could actually communicate what's acceptable. Hey, we don't use racial slurs around here. Hey, we don't make fun of people with disabilities. Hey, listen, we don't talk that way about other genders or other sexual preferences. So through metacommunication, you can actually advocate for other people and you can change society. You actually have the power to change the discourse from negative, from harsh, to actually positive, where everybody feels encouraged and everybody feels respected. So some dimensions of cultures that we can talk about. There's a few. There's individualistic cultures and there's collectivistic cultures. Individualistic cultures focus on the needs of the individuals, while collectivistic cultures prioritize the needs of the group rather than the needs of the individual. Some cultures that do that, like individualistic cultures, there's great example would be the United States. The United States is a very individualistic culture. We kind of focus on independence. We focus on making your way in the world, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's kind of centered around self. So the United States, not always, but in comparison to other cultures, the United States is a good example of a very individualistic culture. Collectivistic cultures that prioritize the needs of the group, example of that would be probably Asian cultures like Japan or even China, where concepts like filial piety, which is taking care of your family, you'll see people live with their families until they get married and then they'll move out. And then when the parents get older and they're no longer to take care of themselves, you'll see in like Asian cultures where they take in their family, and it's very important to honor your parents and take care of them. It's a very big honor in those types of culture. Where in the United States, it's not that uncommon. Your parents get old. You don't want them to be an inconvenience. They don't want to be a burden, so they move into a home. You compare that to Asian cultures, there's really no social security for elderly parents. So it's really up to the families to take in their parents and take care of them because it's a collectivistic culture. So that's just a slight example of that. Power distance refers to the physical distance between those who have power and those who don't. So there's high power cultures where individuals accept power inequalities as normal. So it's kind of thinking, hey, this is this person, this is this culture, these people are in charge, I can't question them. Compared to low power cultures, which de-emphasize de-emphasize the power structures. So the best way I can break it down is looking at different jobs. Every job that you do has a different culture. So I'm sure that you've had jobs before where you could talk one-on-one with your manager and you felt like you could share your frustration or things that you felt could be improved upon. And then you had other jobs where the managers were way high up there and you didn't really feel as inclined to share your perspectives with them. So that would be a high power culture, and a low power culture would be something that you feel you had access to talk a little bit more, and the power structure didn't create major instances of inequality. And that's represented in cultures all around the world. Sorry about that. Gender expectations. There are masculine and feminine societies. You can read more about that. But we're going to move and talk about time orientation. Time orientation is, there's two types. There's short-term orientation and there's long-term orientation. So different cultures have different orientations towards times. Short-term orientations keep schedules and believes that there's a time and a place for everything. So depending on what your culture is, you might be a person that wants things done one right after the next. While people from long-term time orientation, their cultures are more flexible and they focus on more of the quality of life. So they get there when they get there, but they want to focus on the quality of life and take their time and not necessarily worry about a set schedule. Lastly, on this slide, we have high and low context cultures. And high context cultures are very little meaning is contained in words. It has more complex and nuanced cues. So in high context cultures, they actually don't use words as much. They use nonverbals. They use looks. They use all kinds of different things to communicate meaning. Versus a low context culture, the meaning is primarily done through language. So I'll give you an example. The U.S. tends to be a very low context culture. Most of the meaning that we say, that we communicate in the United States is through our words. Now we do use nonverbals, but the words are primarily the source of communication. So in the United States, let's say you were to walk into my house and it was the winter, and I would sit there and say to you, hey, listen, it's pretty cold in here. Can you please close the door? And then you would close the door. But let's say you're in an Asian culture, which has a higher context of culture, and you were to leave the door open. More than likely they wouldn't confront you straight up and say, hey, you need to close the door. That would be seen as rude. What they would say is they would imply. They'd be like, oh, it's very cold in here. And that's it. And it would be up to you as the guest to understand the meaning, to interpret the subtle nuance of that statement, to pull out of it, oh, wow, that means I need to close the door. Okay? So there's cultures that are more direct and use words. Those are low context. There are cultures that are more subtle and nuanced that use nonverbal cues and other ways of communicating, and those are high context cultures. It's important for you to know the difference between the two. So some tips to help you communicate more competently throughout different cultures is to be mindful, be receptive to new information, respect others, keep an open mind. Also, you want to adapt to others and be able to adapt your communication to accommodate other people. And then you want to actively engage others. Seek out opportunities for interaction. Don't just hide behind your own culture, but look forward to interacting with other people. So I want to encourage you to read chapter 3 and make sure you watch the video in its entirety. It's really good, and I think the questions are very concise, but I know you guys are going to do a good job on the discussion. Anyways, I hope you guys have a great week, and I wish you all the success. Talk to you soon.